Hello, and welcome back to Rehydrate. This season, we will be reading and discussing Liu Cixin's Das End, the third and final part of the Remembrance of Earth's Past series. This is Season 5, Episode 1, The Staircase Program, where we'll be discussing all of Part 1. We previously talked about the three-body problem in Dark Forest, and the hosts have varying levels of knowledge of the rest of this book. My name is Dan, and I have read the entire book and the entire series.
This is Tim, and I've only read up to the current week's reading.
This is Amin, and I've also only read up to the current week's reading, and also along with Dan and Talia, I co-host the Rehydrate spoiler cast. So if you have read the entire series, or you're like me and you don't care about spoilers, you should check that out as well. And this is the same RSS feed.
Yeah, and just to clarify, even though this is the final part of the series, we still will be having spoiler casts this season. So be on the lookout for those, because obviously a lot of stuff happens in these books. So I am going to want to discuss them in more detail as we kind of talked about them in increments. And I think this is be an interesting point to listen to the spoiler cast because we'll be talking about stuff like directly in context, like stuff that this part is foreshadowing. We can talk more about that in a little bit more detail rather than like in the three-body problem, like it's harder to foreshadow stuff that happens like all of at the end. So I encourage you to listen to Amin and Talia and myself on the spoiler casts. We're also going to have this season, like I mentioned before, some guest hosts joining us for some future episodes to get a little bit more perspectives on some of the parts that we're going to have for this book. So be on the lookout for that. I also wanted to mention I saw on Reddit, actually, we talked a lot about the Netflix show that's coming up that's going to be done by Benioff and Weiss, but there's also at the same time a Chinese adaptation that's happening. And apparently they put a date on it, which is the fourth quarter of this year. So I don't really know much about it. And there's supposed to be a trailer that I can't seem to find. But if I do find it, I will put a link into it. But the good news is that there will be something sooner than because we really have no idea when the Netflix show is coming out. So it'll be interesting to see that.
Yeah, I think that's great to have like two different visual takes on the series.
Yeah, and I think there's even a third one. There's supposed to be an anime too. I haven't heard any more about that one, but yeah, hopefully it's translated. We'll see.
Yeah, I'm not sure how we would go about watching the Chinese one legally. I'm sure there will be other ways to see it.
Someone mentioned that they just put them on YouTube after some time, and like I don't know if it's legal or whatever, but yeah, apparently like people can just watch the stuff. They have like some what is it like some Chinese TV service has like exclusive content, which is where this is coming from, and apparently they just put it on YouTube. Maybe it's region locked or whatever.
Yeah, Tencent.
Yeah, Tencent. That's right. Yeah, I mean, like you can't get to YouTube in China anyway, so maybe like they're safe to to put it on YouTube and not have to worry about the subscribers in China being able to access it easily
Right.
anyway, without VPNs and all that stuff. We also got another listener email. We got it a couple of weeks ago, but since since we ended up season 3 and starting this one, it's been a couple of weeks. That's why there's this delay in last episode. I did think it was interesting, and it's a listener, Rob. He says, "I think you said you're a computer scientist." Speaking to me, I did study computer science. It's been a while, but I did way back in the day study computer science. If so, they must be familiar with the P equals NP problem. The Dark Forest very briefly mentions one sentence that the droplet solved the traveling salesman problem instantaneously. I'm not an expert myself on the subject, but the idea of the problem is finding the shortest distance needed to travel from city to city without redundancy. What the droplet did was take the problem one tiny step further because some of the Earth spaceships are all moving in different directions. I've got no idea if all the spaceships movements versus the stationary cities add significant complexities to the P equals NP question, though. Again, it's been a while since I studied this stuff, but very, very briefly, like P equals NP is like basically the levels of complexity of solving problems. And if they can be solved in what's called polynomial time, that's what P stands for. Things like adding numbers and finding primes and that kind of stuff is considered to be a P complexity, P problems, because they can be solved, relatively easily. And they can grow large, obviously, but they don't grow exponentially. Where NP problems, or non-deterministic or non-polynomial time, means that they grow exponentially and they can be verified easily by having the solution, but solving them without the solution is very complicated just because of solving things exponentially as it grows becomes really hard. The traveling salesman problem specifically, like I mentioned, is, if you think about, you have all these different points of cities that the salesman has to go to. What's the shortest path between all those cities without going back to each city? So the shortest path. And that's considered to be an NP hard problem, meaning that it's hard to, even given the solution, it's hard just to determine if that's the right solution or that's the proper solution is the shortest path, because you still have to calculate it. So the reason that he mentions this is because you think about the droplet attack, you have this grid of ships that the droplet goes through and destroys all of them. And it has to basically solve the traveling salesman problem of like, what is the shortest path? I mean, obviously it's kind of easy because it's a big grid. The Trisolarians, they mentioned specifically, or they mentioned something in the book that they solved it instantaneously, which obviously is an NP hard problem. So they have either more advanced algorithms. It's not just a matter of computing power; it's more a matter of determining better algorithms, or at least like maybe like they have super advanced computing technology where even solving exponential NP problems is trivial. And on top of that, the traveling salesman problem, they're adding even more complexity by having not just traveling between the shortest path between different points, but like also recalculating it on the fly as the ships kind of move away. So it's an interesting take on a way to think about like how complex and how advanced the Trisolarians are, because like we consider it to be like nigh impossible to do that kind of thing in a static environment, but the Trisolarians just do it relatively easily. I don't know if Tim or Amin, you have any more thoughts on that. I mean, it's I don't think you guys didn't study computer science.
No, I did not. Yeah, so I wasn't familiar with this. I only take it on faith that if they could unfold a proton, that they could
Right.
also do this.
Yeah. So there's some interesting. I mean, there's a lot of like super complicated, theoretical kind of papers, and it's one of like the classical computer science problems. Like, are all NP problems P problems? At the end of the day, it's just a matter of time before we find better algorithms to make them NP, or to make them polynomial. No one knows, or people have different ideas. But I'll link some videos that I think do a good job of explaining them. But it's cool that like Leo Sishin has this kind of stuff in his mind as he's like thinking about different ways that how advanced the Trisolarians actually are, and then the super complicated problem that are basically unsolvable by humans is like just like not a big deal for the Trisolarians.
Yeah, I think the whole droplet, like the droplet itself, is just something designed, just draws from whatever technical experience he has in college, or was similar to the material that the droplet was made out of.
Yeah, the
I
strong
think it's
interaction forces.
yeah, it's there to be like the fulfillment of all their problematic dreams.
Right. Yeah, you can see him like in college, like thinking, "Oh man, what if there's an alien race that solved this thing and like can do
Yeah,
it
solve this thing.
instantaneously?"
Yeah,
Yeah,
right.
definitely. So yeah, like Rob, thanks for your email. I appreciate your thoughts, and I think it's interesting to think about. So let's just jump into the summary for this first part of Death's End. So in the besieged Constantinople, Emperor Constantine XI meets with a prostitute named Helena, who promises to kill his enemies, the Sultan, who is attacking the city. Skeptical, he gives her a test to return with the head of a prisoner, which she seemingly magically achieves, but only returns with his brain. Unfortunately for the Emperor, she is unable to kill the Sultan since the higher dimensional fragment that she ended up using for real had left the Earth behind at that point. We are introduced to Yun Tianming, an aerospace graduate who has late stage terminal lung cancer. He decides rather than spending what little money he has left over, that he will utilize the newly passed euthanasia laws to take his own life. And even after recovering a large sum of money from his old college classmate as a repayment for his drink idea that made his classmate rich, he's not able to use that money towards his treatment. So instead, he decides to anonymously buy DX3906, a remote planetlet star, for his college infatuation, Changxin, utilizing the UN's newly created Stars Our Destination project. At the start of the crisis era, Changxin, an aerospace PhD, joins the newly formed and secretive branch of the PDC called the Strategic Intelligence Agency, or the PIA, where they research ways to defeat the Trisolarians. Initially dismissed because of inherent sexism, she ultimately proposes a plan to fulfill the PIA's mission to accelerate a spy probe to 1% the speed of light to intercept the Trisolarian fleet, meanwhile gaining the trust of her boss, Vladimov, and the PIA chief, Thomas Wade. Her plan, dubbed the Staircase Program, would use bombs detonated in precise succession in space to propel a probe using a sail to the desired speed. During the research phase that started out on sending a hibernating person to a frozen dead person ends up being only a frozen brain to lower the weight enough to be able to achieve the 1% the speed of light. While searching for a suitable candidate to send, her classmate tells her about the terminal condition of her former classmate, Yun Tianming, who she believes would be a good candidate. The PIA works in secret with world governments to pass the euthanasia laws, so a candidate's brain can be harvested to send into space. Tianming's attempt to conduct euthanasia is interrupted by Cheng Xin at the last moment, but he realizes that it is only in a professional capacity, not out of love because he gifted her the star as he initially thought. All the while, Cheng Xin had no idea who had given her the star, which has little value other than sentimental. Tianbing accepts the mission despite his fears of space and the thought of eternal torture at the hands of the Trisolarians. It is only as Tianming is about to die that Wade tells Cheng Xin that it was Tianming who gave her the star, but she just misses him before he dies, and his brain is preserved for spaceflight. She watches as the staircase program is executed. It succeeds in that it achieves the 1% speed of light, but due to a slight error in the direction of the 998th of 1003rd bombs explosions, the probe and Tianming's brain veer off course into the vast expanse of space. With hope lost for the probe and despair for Tianming's future, she accepts the mission to hibernate in hopes that she can help the future PIA in efforts to defeat the Trisolarians. Like we did last season, we do have a slate of new characters again. We have Yun Tianming, who is an aerospace student. We have Hu Wen, who is Tianming's college classmate that gave him all that money for the drink. We have Cheng Xin, who is an aerospace engineer and a PhD. We have Mikhail Vladimov, who is a Russian and Cheng Xi's boss at the PIA. And finally, Thomas Wade, who is an American and also the PIA chief. So I wanted to start with a question for you guys. I know we had started with a Fairlight Problem. We have Wang Miao, and then we move on to Dark Forest. We have Law G and all those characters. Now we're introduced to a whole new slate of characters. Were you expecting that? Does it bother you that we're not having the same main character again?
I guess for me, I expected it, and these opening chapters, kind of took hard swings, both positive and negative in my like enthusiasm because
Yeah.
like the initial Constantinople chapter was really interesting. Like, oh, where is this going? You know, type, and we can talk about that later. But yeah, address your question. Then I kind of like shifting to Yun Changmin, it was a little difficult at first because it was a bit of a bummer to be like, okay, like have to learn this new character, and not so much learning a new character, but we have yet another kind of lovelorn sad sack that
Yeah.
we're
Yeah.
supposed to care about. He's just a even more pitiful version of Luigi, or at least Luigi at the beginning of last previous book.
Yeah.
I know it was a little difficult getting through his like early stages here. It's just like, oh God, like this guy, why do I care about this guy?
No, I had the same thing. Like when I was reading this, I was like another character, like another like he seems very much in the mold initially of Wang Miao and Luo Ji, right?
Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, kind of like Lucian like has his like protagonist in mind, and it's always kind of a nerdy Chinese guy.
right.
Yeah, I mean, getting to see what he's set up for, like,
Yeah,
obviously took a turn that I wasn't expecting, and as like Chang Xin introduced and kind of made more of a character, as well as I liked the two PIA guys.
hmm.
Like it got more interesting, but yeah, a bit of a dip in my enthusiasm, at least in the early goings, especially kind of after the hard turn of the Constantinople chapter.
How about you, I mean?
Yeah, I felt the same. I think somewhere in the last book, I stopped being really invested in the characters at all because I don't think these books are about the characters. They're just about this situation that Earth is in and what kind of cool science fiction stuff can happen as a result of that. Again, knowing that this was going to be these types of jumps, I wasn't surprised that there were different characters, but also, like both you and Tim said, he was cut from the same mold, at least initially, as some of the other characters, but that's not what really I was focused on.
Sure, but I mean, the author gives you enough of their internal monologue, and that he seems like he wants you to care about these characters and be interested in them to
Yeah,
so which is again could be a bit of a break, or just the pacing of the series took a little bit of a downturn here, but it wasn't for long, so pretty positive on this, opening section overall. But yeah, a little bit of a sigh, when we are introduced to him.
Yeah, I'll say without spoilers that I mean, obviously I've said this millions of times, but like this is my favorite of all the books, and that's a very common sentiment across a lot of the fans of the series. But I think it is my favorite because the characterization is generally much better for the characters that we follow throughout this book, and the science is also like at a much grander scale. I think
Right.
and I think you can tell that in the early chapters too. Maybe not the science. I mean, the science is kind of more. It's awesome, right? Like the Syracuse program is really cool, but like it's not as like groundbreaking. It's more grounded in like kind of reality because like we're in basically present times, right?
Right.
But I think you can already tell like the internal monologue of Yun Ming and and Cheng Xin and her already she's starting to kind of have more agency, or not even kind of has more agency than any other female character that we really had, besides maybe Ye Wenjie. I think you can already tell like the seeds are being planted there of more characters to kind of hang on to throughout the book.
Yeah, I will say, I mean, they are characterized relatively well compared to the rest of the series in a short amount of time.
Yeah.
So yeah, I had a very good like impression of who Tianming was, like fairly early on. It was just like who he was like, you
Yeah.
know, and again, it takes a turn, but it did feel like, he's being set up to, okay, here's another nerdy Chinese guy who's going to be special for some reason.
Right. I think what another thing was interesting about the start of this book is that in the second book we didn't really have many through lines between the first and second book, but I think we just in this first part we already have like at least references or direct perspectives from characters we know. So we have a whole chapter from Yang Dong, who we didn't really meet direct.
Right.
I mean, we kind of talked. We had a chapter from her perspective in Three Body Problem, but she has like a whole like chapter here where she talks about some pretty interesting concepts. We can talk about those a little bit later. And she at that time she also references her mother Ye Wenjie and like learning that she was actually the person communicated by Trisolaris. We have Luo Ji is sort of like a kind of mythical figure almost, right? Like he's like, oh, this famous wall facer, and he's like Chinese, and then like they're kind of like in the mix as he's getting the assassination attempt at the UN building right after he gets shot by the ETO during the assassination attempt. And then we also have a kind of a indirect reference to Wang Miao, where when they talk about the staircase program and the sail, they talk about the material that's actually holding the sail is the flying blade material. That was the big thing that the Trisolarians were one of the big things that the Trisolarians were trying to stop in Three Body Problem. The nanomaterial that actually cut the Judgment Day ship in half. But it seems like they have a lot of different uses for it. I think they're going to use it for the sail. They're going to use it for the space elevator. So it's making another return here. I thought was cool.
Yeah, it seems like it's I think we've talked about this before. It was kind of like an unnecessary sort of technological leap that's not realistic in our real world present day, but he kind of had to invent this nanomaterial or invent the idea that it is possible in our present day early 2000s technology for the rest of Earth's technological efforts to be possible here. It was definitely an interesting reset. I wasn't expecting to go like back to, let's say, present day or the early days of the crisis. And I think
Yeah.
it's interesting having this kind of parallel perspective and this parallel story going on.
This is a question for Tim because Tim
Yeah.
hasn't studied these books as closely as Dan. But Tim, do you think that if a reader was coming in and this was the first and only book they read, do you think they would be completely lost, or do you think he does a good job of setting the world and all that kind of stuff? I thought I thought he did a good job of the Constantinople thing. I thought was a good mysterious type of opening, and then he throws you in this world. And I don't think, again, I don't think the Trisolarians or the characters or anything matter that much, but I thought he did a good job of establishing the world much more quickly in this book than he did in other books. And I was just wondering what your thoughts on that were.
So asking like from the perspective of somebody for whatever reason started with the third book in the series.
Correct.
It's hard to. I mean, it's hard to put myself in that mindset. I guess now that you say that, I guess as a like contained story, it's hard to answer. I mean, my instinct is to say like no, because like as you like after the Constantinople chapter, there's like all of this like context for what's going on that's a lot of world building to do. to sort of outline what the crisis is and why people are doing what they're doing.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it kind of offhand a couple of times. Like, I think you and Tim Ming is like saying, "Oh, now the media doesn't care so much about like the Trisolarans, or not as much anymore." I think they mentioned the Sofon block a couple times, but like I think that stuff would be kind of hard to comprehend if
Yeah.
you didn't have the context of the first two books.
Like if somebody gave me this as and didn't even tell me it was the third book and something, and just gave me this manuscript or whatever, like I would definitely think I was still reading a story that was like in progress or in media res.
I think it also brings up an interesting point about the one thing that I thought of when it was announced that this series was going to be made into a TV show, about the timelines and how they're actually going to film it. And one of the early ideas that I don't remember, I came up with it or someone else came up with it, but I think someone else came up with it. But anyway, like the idea of like cutting Chengxin and Luoji's story together, because they happen kind of simultaneously here. The issue of like kind of transitioning main character to main character is like maybe okay for a book, but I think it's going to be difficult for a TV show to kind of maintain having a separate character every single TV show. And I think a way to do it, because they happen contemporaneously, is to have Chengxin's story and Luoji's story happening, maybe at the same time, and like kind of cutting back and forth.
I could see that. I don't necessarily think it wouldn't like work if they kept the structure as it is, as like a third season opening stinger is like. I think that would grab the audience enough to kind of like reset and go back and like see that this whole other thing was going on. I don't think it's necessary for them to do that, but that's an interesting idea. I guess for me it depends on like how much that would like spoil, like how well they sync up. I don't know obviously what happens in this book, after this section. So would you have to then like cut off one branch and focus on somebody else, because to show the other side would spoil too much for the other branch.
Yeah, I think it'd be also interesting if like they didn't cut the stories together. Like how, to me, I thought it was really cool how like Luoji becomes like sort of like this famous figure that we've been following for the past like book, right? And then all of a sudden, like now he's like just like some famous guy in the eyes
Right.
of your new main character. So that's an interesting perspective, I think.
I like the idea of intercutting, but I agree with Tim that I think finding out much later that this whole other thing was going on at the same time, and I'm not to be spoilerish, but I'm assuming that the stories intersect again at some point. Yeah, I'm sure the logistics of filming all of this is going to be massive. Although I assume Game of Thrones was massive as well. Again, only having as much knowledge as up to part one of this book, I think the sequence it's in I think raises the interest the most, rather than just having it all revealed at once.
And then, so both of you guys also had mentioned that you really like the Constantinople chapters. I guess maybe we can talk about that a little bit more.
I think it was, yeah, definitely interesting. I read this first chapter like about a week ago, so there's some things I'm still like quite remember, whether if it explains how Helena like actually had magical. I mean, obviously the reveal here is that some alien thing was present, a higher dimensional fragment, whatever that is.
Yeah.
Gave her some sort of an ability, but I don't quite remember what her like ability was, or why they what, like how her magical powers manifested.
Well, I think the main thing was that when the emperor asked her to get the head of the guy, of the
Yeah.
the prisoner, as a test, she came back with just the brain, and then they opened the guy's head and he had no brain. And they're like, well, how the hell did you do that? And like the reveal later on of the higher dimensional fragment is supposed to give you a clue of like how maybe she got that.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure if that, yeah, the brain thing ties into, the brain we sent Futurama like in a capsule to
Right.
the Trisolarans.
Yeah, I like
Yeah.
the opening chapter too, partly because it seemed more. So it didn't seem like, at first, it didn't seem like science fiction. It seemed more like fantasy. Like there's this
Yeah.
magical whatever that was going on, and again, it was the world was so different, and the storytelling was so different from everything else. I think that's what was most interesting to me, and I like historical fiction, and I guess historical fantasy fiction or whatever. So I would have read a whole book about this, but obviously that's not what we're reading.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
yeah, I think this is dipping into the, ancient aliens kind of, trope, what we have thought of in the past as magical or miraculous things, might have been alien, technology or alien presences, making themselves
Yeah,
known. And I think this is kind of I don't know, a cool little spin on that.
yeah, exactly. And I would have loved to see that explored more.
I don't know if this comes back or we kind of, I imagine at some point, this is kind of the opening singer will like understand what the higher dimensional fragment was. But yeah, I mean, I think also the interesting thing here is that obviously there was some contact with aliens or alien presence much earlier in our history. And I don't know if that kind of goes back to the dark forest concept, in that this was whether this has a direct correlation to what we're seeing in the present day, with the Trisolarans, or has something to do with the Trisolarans, or if this was just some rare intersection with one of the other alien races, that the universe is supposedly teeming with.
Dan, do you remember your reaction to this the first time you read it?
I think I didn't like it that much. I was like, I wanted to get back to the story, like I wanted to like, why are we like set in this historical setting? I think it didn't super register with me the first time that it was like a higher dimensional fragment, like how important that was. I mostly just want to get back to space, right? And like that was my reaction the first time I read it. I think in context, thinking back on it, it is important and it is interesting. But yeah, like initially that was my reaction. And speaking of kind of broad reactions to this book, a major criticism that's kind of levied across this book and the entire series is the sexism, right? Like people always kind of say like, oh, this series, this book, this author is maybe misogynist or sexist, and we kind of see, and I don't know that I agree with that, but like I think there's some examples here that kind of lend itself to that criticism. So obviously all of the low G parts in Dark Forest pretty much are kind of told from a misogynist point of view, where low G doesn't really. I mean, he cares about just his wife, who becomes his wife in the abstract, but more as like a thought of, I guess, perfect woman. And then we have Wang Miao kind of being a stalker, and then Yun Ming like really being a stalker here. Like even going to the point where he like goes to Shanghai to try to just wait for Chengxin to try to see her. I mean, I guess it's his dying wish, right? But still, it's not a good look, I think. And then we have all of the, when Chengxin starts putting her ideas forth to the PIA, like everyone's like dismissive of her. Everyone's like, oh, she's just a girl, like she can't have good ideas. And then like she eventually has the best idea. And they also like have a super sexist reaction to her. And I quoted a passage here saying, but they are mostly men, and they thought by just giving her a chance to talk, they would have a perfect excuse to appreciate her physical attributes. Like ugh. So like they're just like letting her talk to just like check her out. It's not great.
Yeah, I mean, it's the case where it's fuzzy as to whether it's just the author depicting sexism consciously, or whether there's a sexist part of himself that's inserting himself in the narrative and expressing himself through this. I mean, it's kind of fuzzy to me. Like, I don't think, because, obviously with the reactions that you just mentioned with Shang Xin, it's like, he's constantly expressively acknowledging sexism. Like he's
Yeah.
saying, oh, these guys are sexist. He's like, it's not because Lu Shixin, himself is just sort of naturally expressing sexism here. I think the more possibly damning parts is just the constant with like Luigi and Yun Ming. It's like you're not sure, because this age Jiangming seems like a protagonist of a sort. You're just not sure whether these are somewhat self inserts of the author, or he's just consciously writing these kind of sexist characters and just saying, hey, these are flawed guys, flawed protagonists.
Yeah. And maybe that's just the biggest flaw I can think of, is like maybe these characters are just, too introverted and nerdy to overtly go after like real women, people that they're interacting with, rather than like making them up in their mind, or, like remembering someone who'd like happened to talk to you in college.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it could go both ways. It's just like, is he drawing upon his experience with this type of guy that that he's well acquainted with, or is he that guy in a sense? And I think it's kind of up in the air. I don't really know, other than to like maybe read more interviews with him or to really know. But
Yeah.
but the obviously across the sort of focus on male characters is just in a general sense, I think a knock against the series, or
Yeah, I agree with Tim. I think it's annoying and probably frustrating to read all the sexist responses, but also, I mean, if you want to give the author the benefit of the doubt, he's just doing a very effective job of depicting the inner monologue of these sexist characters. But I don't know if people are prepared to give him the benefit of the doubt, because yeah, I think in general his female characters are written in such a way that it just seems more awkward coming from in this context than it would normally. I think like it really doesn't establish any character other than just to say, hey, look at her, she's attractive, and that's all people care about.
Yeah.
And of course she wins in the end, wins being in air quotes. So maybe he's trying to show that all these other people are wrong to be sexist, but I don't know.
I mean, he obviously has, important female characters, Yi Wen-ji and now Changxin, and the head of the UA, or the UN
Oh
is a
yeah.
woman, so it's obviously he just doesn't camp on them too long, or make them the central characters of the books. And to kind of point to a comment you put further down in the notes, that like the meta commenting on his own work, where he says, one of the characters talks about Tiang Ming's
Giving this.
purchasing of the star.
Yeah.
He says, and he just made a romantic gesture that I'd call ridiculous if I read it in a book or saw it in a movie. Like he seems to know that he's writing Tiang Ming as kind of this pitiful character. So I don't think he's like an author self-insert or anything like that. I think he knows that he's kind of a little pathetic and a little sexist in a way.
Yeah, I put that quote in there because like there's some other. I wanted to kind of like put that in your mind because there's some other instances of self-referential criticism of his own work in this book. So just keep a lookout for that. And I also remember reading. I don't have it in front of me, but I remember reading an interview or a translated interview from Liu Xin saying about like asking him specifically about sexism and the character of Chang Xin, and he was saying something like in his mind like he doesn't really think about the characters as being male or female, but kind of thinks more about archetypes of the characters. I don't think he's inherently sexist or misogynist, but yeah, more playing on the kind of nerdy engineer archetype to kind of fulfill the story role. And then yeah, Yuan Ming here obviously like needed to anonymously give the star to her, and like so a way that he would do that is yeah because he couldn't talk to her face to face, so he wanted to anonymously do it. The next thing I want to talk about was actually during the last spoiler cast, we had given a question to Amin. Like, Amin had said that he thought the end part of Dark Forces was particularly interesting because they revealed the title of the story in there, and I was like, oh yeah, Dark Force. And then so also early in this book, we also get the meaning of Death's End, and I'll just read the quote here saying, as modern biology advanced apace, people began to believe that death's end would be achievable in 1 or 2 more centuries. If so, those who chose hibernation were taking the first steps on the staircase to life everlasting. So there you go. That's the meaning of death's end. I actually told Amin that it was not as profound as Dark Forest, but anyway, did you catch that, Amin, when you were reading it?
Yeah, I did catch that, and you're right, it wasn't as profound.
I remember when I was like, "Oh, I wonder what death end means," and like I think your answers were actually better when because you had said something like, "Yeah, it's about like the end of the universe," or what was it?
Yeah, it was something like that.
Yeah, when there's no more life, there's no more death.
Right.
But yeah, I think it's kind of interesting that he, like obviously the hibernation is a big part of the second book, and how humans get to jump into the future. It's interesting that he kind of chose to have this little side like insert to flesh out. Well, I mean, he really doesn't. Well, yeah, I mean, he does describe a bit of the I guess science. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't like I don't think it's meant to be like convincing because it's obviously not possible. But
Mm.
the way he described how we like replace somebody's blood with this
Oh
like
yeah, the antifreeze
cool
stuff, right?
yeah, with like antifreeze. He never really says how we like put the blood back in, I guess. But I guess suppose if you can replace it with one leg, you can put it back in, or what how you store it.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't know if I don't know if he's like introducing the sort of science or the your pseudoscience, behind hibernation, whether that's
Yeah, I
becomes
mean,
more important later on in this book. But it is yet another kind of like he bites off a lot, like like philosophical and scientific concepts. And this it seems like another thing he's throwing on the pile here.
yeah,
Talking about how you could write a whole series about what would it mean for just humanity just to be able to like live forever, or at least hibernate, put themselves in stasis forever without having a intergalactic alien story. What would that just mean for life on Earth?
right. I mean, we already see in like the last book where Logi and Dasher like kind of travel to the future via hibernation and get cured, right? So
Right.
that presumably extends their lifespan for however many years. So people can theoretically live forever, right? If they just keep if they can't figure out what the problem is now, hibernate for a couple hundred years. They'll probably figure it out then.
Right, and there's a zillion social issues you could, camp out on
Yeah,
that would come from that, like who gets to do it, who's privileged enough to, have access to that, and why,
right.
why them and not this person.
Yeah, I mean, it'll just for if it was for real, it just end up being rich people. The next thing I want to talk about is just a parallel I saw when I was reading this book is the euthanasia process that Yuntain or the other guy, Yuntain's roommate, and then Yuntain Ming follow, where they have to like go through all those different prompts to like make sure that they really want to do it. It just really reminded me of the mental skill process, and I thought the mental skill process was interesting in itself. And like this is just like another continuation of kind of like really making sure that you want to undergo this thing where mental seal obviously doesn't kill you, but euthanasia does kill you. So did that remind you guys of that part?
I think it's another example of how he does a good job at like thinking through the like legal framework some of these things would have to, happen through,
Hmm.
realistically. And it didn't like directly make me think of the mental seal other than like that aspect that
Yeah.
he tends to think through at least the higher level legal framework that this might have to, if it were introduced into society, would have to undergo.
Yeah, I thought that was interesting how I mean, at the end of the day, they passed it because they wanted to get a brain, right? Like
Right.
they kind of secretly passed it, but they couldn't just like take people's brains. Like people had to volunteer to do it, but even if they volunteered to die, they couldn't do it. So, yeah, it was an interesting workaround to actually like getting a brain to send into space.
Sure.
And they didn't even end up using it for Yu Ming's brain. I guess let's just get into the staircase program here. Like I said, the staircase program was just a way to take a probe, and I don't know, like they had like a really like solid purpose in their mind to do it, other than like, well, we probably should just do something, right? And so they said, let's send a probe, and then like I think it kind of got munged around, saying like, well, let's send a person. It ended up being just like turning to a brain, just the sheer logistics of it. So, but I mean, this is this part's big scientific kind of concept, and it's an interesting concept too, where you have like the series of bombs exploding in a very, very particular pattern to be able to accelerate it to 1% the speed of light.
So this concept reminded me, not the going to the speed of light, but if you're a million years old and you played the original I don't know, maybe other Metroids as well, but I played the original Metroid on the Nintendo Entertainment System, and once you get the bomb, you can like set off bombs and curl into a ball, and like you can shoot yourself over walls that you wouldn't be able to jump over otherwise. So that's what I thought of this whole time when they were describing this. I was like, oh, it's just like in Metroid. So
That's cool.
I
That's a good analogy. I
that,
like
that,
that.
was, that was the connection I made with it. Obviously
Well,
not the speed part, but the going somewhere where you wouldn't be able to get to otherwise part.
and it's your quest to kill a brain in a jar too. So
Yes,
it likes Metroid too.
I didn't make that connection, but you're right.
To backtrack a bit to like this excerpt, near the beginning of this chapter where he talks about the crisis infantilism, to me also seems like a bit of another like meta commentary on his work, or meta commentary on like the past, the previous book, in that he talks about the Wall Facer project and the Stars Are Destination as these, pretty much says that they're these just almost goofy kind of flailings of humanity in crisis, of like not knowing how to handle this. And we talked in the previous book about how like the Wallfacer project seemed pretty goofy.
And humanity thought that too, right? Like
Right.
when he woke up 200 years in the future or 180 years in the future, they're like, wall facers. Who had,
Right.
that ancient stupid joke, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think he like because this whole, like staircase, project, it's cool in a sense, but it is also very goofy, and it also seems like the product of crisis infantilism. And I don't know if he was introduced this excerpt at the beginning to kind of like set this up. Yeah, I mean, the science behind it is neat. And the way he frames this as, like nuclear bombs are, at this point in our technology, seem like a relatively primitive or conventional weapon, or conventional technology, and how this is like an expression of our physics research being locked down. That this was kind of an expression of us just managing to achieve, the almost the impossible with what we got. Like I thought that was like interesting. This whole plan to send a brain in a jar still seems really really goofy to me. Not just because of Futurama. Um, like the leap to like I to what they hope to achieve with this brain, and by sending this, like the initial idea of a probe or something that could gather information obviously makes, some sense, but when that's, obviously found to be impossible because of the weight of the equipment. So like we can't even send a person, we can send a brain. This still seems like this is such a shot in the dark to me. Even if you could bank on the idea that the Trisolarans would have some way that they would even want to like reconstruct the brain into a thinking person that could achieve what? They have this passage at the end of the chapter here where they say that, I guess, no, yeah, I'll read it here for a second. Like the PIA didn't even need to figure out what the spy had to do when he or she got there, as long as the person could safely and successfully be inserted into the fleet. The possibilities were endless. Given the Trisolarans are transparent in thought and vulnerable to stratagems, Wade's idea became even more attractive. That's pretty much the justification for it. That seems like really, really flimsy. Like the possibilities are all endless that they just might punt the brain out the airlock. Like this seems like such a Hail Mary pass
Yeah.
for for this enormous effort.
I think it's like during the crisis era, they're just trying to think of anything they can do.
Right.
And like the Wallfacer program is that kind of thing. It's like, I don't know, let's just send a spy into the Trisolarans like fleet. Like, and maybe like they'll be able to infiltrate, maybe they'll send messages back, like worst case, like we don't get anything out of it, right? Like that's yeah, it's yeah, like you said, a Hail Mary pass. Like, let's just try something. And they needed to try something. Maybe they actually thought it would work, or maybe it's just like to placate the public to show that they're trying to do something.
Well, yeah, but is this like secretive? Like it doesn't seem like this. They're very public facing with this. Like he tends to talk about the societal reaction to like wall facers and other things, but he doesn't really like go into that here. So I kind of just thought like this was just something being done kind of on the down low, like a little
Hmm. Yeah, I'm not
secret
sure.
side project.
I mean, they definitely know. I mean, the staircase program where they launched, 1,000 bombs into space, like
Yeah.
the public would have realized that. But they could have had a cover story for that too. Like, who knows? Like, we're just putting bombs around the solar system, right? Yeah, I don't know if they actually like announced it. I guess I always like had the impression like this is our plan. Like we're sending a spy into Trisolarans. Maybe they didn't like detail like they're just sending a brain. Yeah, that was my guess anyway.
Yeah, it's just at this point it feels a little bit of a repeat of Dark Forest or the whole Wallfacer and Luigi project, in that like here's this initial thing that seems very goofy, but especially with Luigi's spell and everything around that, but that obviously like at the end of the book like wraps around to being extremely important, and Luigi being extremely important for reasons that seem counterintuitive at first. And is this the setup for another one of those things? We send Tiang Ming's brain into space, gets blown off course, but like, is this going to turn around and be very important?
Yeah, someone actually had the interesting comment on Reddit too. Someone like a side of the podcast or whatever. Someone posted an interesting question about They said, wouldn't it be extremely dangerous to shoot a human brain as it tries to learn fleet? At this point, the Welfare Project was already in full swing. So I think the idea here is that like, all right, well, we sent a brain to them. Like, could they just map that brain? Could they just like figure out how to think? Like how they could read our thoughts by just like
Right.
they already obviously have like super advanced technology if they're willing to like say like they can revive the brain and clone Yin Ming or what have you.
Right.
So is this also short-sighted?
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it to me because it's like even if like this, successfully inserted into the fleet as a sleeper agent, he even says that he has no, he doesn't take the oath and says that he has no loyalty to humanity. Like, what are they expecting to him to do, and how would they even communicate those ideas, or how would he even communicate anything back? It seems a lot of effort for a very, very goofy Hail Mary pass.
Yeah, I mean, on top of that, like the oath was even a test in Wade's eyes, right? Like if he had taken the oath, he wouldn't have chosen him.
Right.
Side note: do you have any thoughts on Wade himself? Wade seems kind of like for a typical kind of jerk boss with like he's just giving Changxin a hard time to give her a hard time, right?
Yeah, he seemed more like a sociopath than just a bad boss or whatever. Because
Yeah,
what they
he's
say,
like looking for
he's
like
happy when other people are sad, and he's sad when other people are happy. Like
yeah.
that's not normal.
Yeah, he just seems like kind of a jerk, but kind of an eyes on the prize kind of guy.
Yeah,
Is he the leader we need? I don't know.
right, right. Yeah, like he keeps talking about like, would you sell your mother to a whorehouse and like, will you make the hard decisions, that kind of stuff. And like, yeah, the maybe it's just like another commentary on Americans because he's like the only American in the
Yeah,
story. It's like,
right,
oh, that's what Americans are like. They're all just like, militaristic, jerks, sociopaths.
right.
Yeah. So, any other like thoughts around like, I guess like, what are your like overall impressions of this first part? I mean, I think it's very much in the like. I think it was a hard turn between Three Body Problem and Dark Forest, but I think that Death's End is very much in the it seems to flow better. From one story, like this seems more like it was more thought out, right? As like if you think of like Back to the Future, like part one was very different from parts two and three, where they're
Yeah.
filmed simultaneously. This sort of seems like in that sort of mold to me.
Yeah, I kind of felt that way too. Yeah, at the end of this, it's constant through line through this series. It's kind of hard to see where it's going, which is interesting. Although I think kind of what I mentioned earlier, that in some ways this setup, seems like a bit of a repeat of the wall facer project, or like the plot of the, and I kind of hope it isn't. Like we spent a lot of time building up to this, launching a brain into space. I imagine it's going to end up being important for some reason. So yeah, I mean, I guess a bit of a criticism of this is that like it feels like a similar like story beat to the second book, but given that we've seen so much of the future, the farther couple hundred years in the future, at this point I'm curious as to when it makes that leap, or if it makes that leap and we get to, and this being the final book, when we actually get to meet the Trisolarans, and also whether Ching Shin is sort of like ends up being like the protagonist of this book, the way Luigi did, was of the previous one.
So Tim, on the last episode of the last or 2 seasons ago, I don't know how we're doing seasons. Dan not warned you, but guided you to not read the list of all the eras and all that. Did you manage to skip that, or did you actually
Yeah,
read it? Oh,
I
okay.
did not read that. Yeah.
Oh.
So no, I don't. I mean, like as I was reading this on a Kindle, so as I like paged by, I saw that there was like a list of things, but I successfully unfocused my eyes enough to
Good.
not really take in anything too much, about it.
Yeah.
Well, I read that whole thing. So I
So you read the okay. So without spoiling it, do you think reading the Table of Errors would have been a spoiler?
no, I don't.
No, you don't. Oh, interesting.
I mean, a spoiler for the book or the spoiler for this section?
For the book.
Yeah, because we'll talk about it on the spoiler cast.
Okay.
I'll let you know why I don't think it was.
All right.
Again, I don't think about this as critically as other people do, probably.
And we also have very different tolerance for spoilers.
Yes, that's also true. I so far probably the same as Tim. So some of this feels like a rehash, and again, these characters don't seem. I'm not invested in the characters really. I'm more invested in what the plot, what's going to happen regarding the plot, and partly regarding the science fiction. Like the staircase program was a cool thing, but really, I don't know. It feels like a rehash of the previous book, like Tim was saying.
Yeah, I get that because it's like it's more like we just got done with 200 years in the future technology, right? And now we're going back to basically present day technology. So yeah, I get that.
Yeah, and basically, here's a plan to get the Trisolarans. In last book, it didn't work, so now here's another plan to get the Trisolarans. Maybe it'll work.
I think Chang-Xin is a relatively decent, interesting character so far. In that, just she seems like a conflicted character. In that she's obviously not a sociopath, but does a pretty shitty thing. And how she, as pitiful as Tiangming might be, he doesn't like deserve that treatment. Where she basically comes in all weepy eyed and he thinks that she has at least some sort of affection or feelings for him, and she only kind of does like after the fact when she realizes what he's going to go through and what's
Yeah, I actually wonder why like she was so like yeah like so emotional. Like it seemed like very much change, right? Like from Yun Tae Ming's chapter, like she was all
right.
crying, and then like later on, like she's just kind of more professional about it.
Yeah, I
So,
don't.
I mean, was she acting or I don't think so. I mean, was she just emotional because like her project was in danger? Like this is like a good chance for her to like find like a good candidate. So she was like worried that she's going to lose that chance. I mean,
Yeah,
she
this.
describes as Yun Timing as like more of an acquaintance. So like, I don't think she
Right.
really had any direct attachment to him.
No,
Not right now anyway.
it almost feels like a bit of a plot hole because you're right. There is a big like discrepancy between how Tang Min describes that, where she like comes in and hugs him, and
Yeah.
this is also before she even knows that she bought, he purchased the star for her,
Yeah.
so it's not like there was, oh, just at least some emotionality coming from that. So she was putting on an act, or that's pretty damn sociopathic, even though she's clearly not emotionally conflicted after the fact.
Yeah, I don't think that. I don't think that was. I mean, I guess like I think the best explanation is that she was more worried about her job and like the status of the project than him himself, right? He was just like a means to the end of.
Yeah.
She thought he was the best candidate to fulfill that program, and then he was almost going to, like ruin it, right?
Yeah.
That was my take anyway.
Yeah. It also is a huge coincidence.
Yeah,
Maybe it's just necessary for the story, but huge coincidence that this, lovelorn past acquaintance for her, happens to be the best terminally ill patient
yeah, yeah.
and candidate for this.
So I guess finally the I guess like a very broad question for both of you guys. I mean, you have a little more context than Tim, or a lot more context. But if you had to guess right now, do you think that this book will end in like a happy way, a sad way, or like an in between way?
I would definitely say an in between way. I mean,
Hmm.
I don't know what that means, like
Or
there's
an
a lot of.
ambiguous way. Sorry, I guess ambiguous is more of a a better term than in between.
Yeah, I don't think I don't think the author is necessarily interested in like happy or sad outcomes. Like I think it's just more about the implications and the concepts, that are introduced and extrapolated upon. And he's obviously shown some very dark things already, and I think he kind of like, even in this chapter when Tiang Ming talks about how he could potentially be, tortured eternally if the
Yeah.
Trisolarans have their desire and the capability to do so. Like I'm not sure, I mean, this it's part of the strength of the series that it keeps you guessing. Yeah, I don't necessarily see this being like some sort of triumphant Steven Spielberg-y ending to this.
For all the kids riding their bike and they save the day, beat the Trisolarans with like some weapon they made in the garage.
Right. I don't think he's a nihilist either, so I don't.
Hmm.
I would say I think I'm more interested in seeing where this part of the story goes than I was in probably either of the previous two books.
Hmm.
I think he does a better job of setting conditions that make it interesting for the viewer to continue on. So
Do you
um,
think that's colored by the fact that Talia and I keep talking about how awesome this book is?
I do think that's part of it. I will say, like, this book hasn't. I know we've only read 1/7 of this book so far, or whatever it
Yeah.
is, but I don't think it's blown me away yet. Where it's like, oh my god, this is the best book I've of the series, but it's also not. It's not the worst, like the other Dan said. So, so
Yeah.
I'm not committing to either side yet, but I'm leaning towards you and Talia more than this other. character.
Yeah, to bring that back a little bit, I don't know if we discussed it on the main show, but yeah, Dang Wing specifically said like the staircase program was his favorite part of this whole book, which is not true. Like, I mean, like it's interesting. Like I think it's like I said, it's a cool part. It's a cool idea based off of like given the SOFON limitation and given current state of technology and given the fact that we just need to do something. Like it's a cool idea to do it and like as a executed in an interesting way, and it almost worked. I mean, it worked, I guess, in a way. It just didn't work entirely on the direction they wanted to put it at. But it's definitely
Yeah,
not the best part of the book.
yeah, I definitely don't. I mean, even on a kind of grand, like, scientific, technological stunt scale, like, I don't necessarily think it's the coolest thing, but it is a good, like, it gives some context and some verisimilitude to and some background to how humanity kind of reached the state it did, that like future humanity that we saw in the past book. Like, how did, even with the SOFON lock and the physics lock, how did they, we manage to achieve this? And this does a good job of giving some context to this, that through just kind of ingenuity and using what we got in creative ways, we were able to kind of progress, technologically, instead of just stagnating. So I think it was cool world building in that, sense. But yeah, it's not even necessarily like, just from a bombast perspective, is as cool as like Ray Diaz's like blowing up Mercury planet, from the previous book.
All right. Well, thank you very much for listening. And please check out rehydrate.space for released episodes, reading list, pronunciation guide, and all the other stuff that we put up on the website. And leave comments by emailing us at rehydrate@fastmail.com or on Twitter at rehydratepod. And join us next time for Season 5, Episode 2, The Sword Holders, covering the first half of Part 2 of Descend by Illusion.